Hey, thanks for clicking on this video. My name is Zaji, and today I want to share with you a little bit about some sewing things. In particular, we're going to be sewing through the pattern that I have on right now, Simplicity 9275, and we're going to be doing this pattern start to finish. I am very excited about finally getting a sew with me video up, kind of sew along type video. I know loads of you have been asking me for these types of videos, so please do leave your feedback down below in the comment section and let me know how I did. I'd love to hear your feedback. I also do want to point out that in the video I don't have my hand tattoo yet, so that's a recent change. But yeah, if you like sewing type stuff, want to see future sew-alongs and future sewing content from me, please don't hesitate to subscribe and like the video. And yeah, let's get started. Okay, so Simplicity 9275 is actually a pattern that I got in a haul, and you all saw me talk about this pattern and talk about this very same slub knit before, and so I did make it, and I now have made it with you all. So we're gonna get into all the stuff about this pattern. This pattern is offered from size 8 to size 24. I want to talk about some of the basic things before we get sewing that you will need to know before making this pattern. I would classify this as being an easy pattern if you're someone who knows how to use your sewing machine and has maybe worked with 1 or 2 projects before. You would be able to tackle this project. You will need some sort of stretch stitch capability, so either a zigzag stitch, 3-step zigzag, lightning bolt stitch, or you can use your overlocker or serger to put this project together, but you will still also need a sewing machine for various steps in this project as well. So for some of the basting and the top stitching, if you're not going to be using a cover stitch machine to top stitch. I am going to be using my cover stitch to top stitch in this video, so I have rearranged the steps of this pattern so that I can accommodate having to only switch my machine over once in the middle of making this pattern, because I have a Pfaff Cover Lock 4.0 which does both cover stitching and overlocking, so I have to completely switch my machine around when I go between those functions. But if that's not something that's of concern to you, you can top stitch where they specify in the pattern as well, or when I do my top stitching as well. You will also need either a jersey needle, a ball needle, or a stretch needle. Those all are really for knit fabrics. It is really my huge recommendation that you do use the proper needle, because that can really affect how you're stitching and everything. But you will also need to get some lightweight fusible interfacing. I used just a scrap piece from my my stash, but you could get knit interfacing for this project as well, specifically, especially if you have something that's very, very stretchy that has a lot of lycra in it. You'll probably want to go ahead and use a knit interfacing, as well as stabilizing some seams. Now, I didn't end up stabilizing mine because I am using a fabric that is quite stable, so I don't expect to experience any real stretching out right here. So if you have something that's like viscose or 100% cotton, over time those do tend to stretch out, so you'll probably want to add in either some seam tape, or you could use 3/8 of an inch clear elastic, or 1/4 inch clear elastic. Either of those would work in the seam, and those will really help to keep this seam from stretching out. So that's also going to depend on what kind of fabric you're using as well. But you can use a couple of different types of knits for this project. You can use cotton interlock, cotton linen blends, jerseys, or ponte. I would go far as to say you could use sweater knits and even some sweatshirt fabric, sweatshirting, fleece, sweatshirt fleece. That too would work with this project really well, as well as like French terry would work really beautifully, as well as like double knits too. You will just want a little bit of stretch within the fabric though, it looks like probably 20% stretch, 30% stretch, you'd probably be okay, because their stretch knit rule is quite small. It doesn't have to move very much at all, because they have on the back, you can look and see and test your fabric and see if it's stretchy enough for the pattern. So I do just want to mention that I am going to be changing the directions for making this pattern quite a bit. I'm going to be doing them in my own method, so this is not the same instructions that you have in your pattern envelope. So if something is confusing, or if I've said something that is not easy to understand and you'd like for me to clarify on a step, please just let me know in the comment section down below, because yeah, I'd love to know. I don't want to confuse anyone by changing these around, but I do find that there's just some ways of doing things that I prefer when I'm making garments, and I'd like to share that with you today. It's just an alternative method to put it together. So yeah, that's going to be the end of me blabbering on about making this. Let's go ahead and get started making it now. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to be sewing on Simplicity 9275. Mine is just from the rack, so it is a little bit different numbering up top, but it is still the same pattern. We're going to be sewing up the version that the model is actually wearing in the sample, which is version A. The techniques in this video you will be able to use to make all of the versions, with a slight modification for version C. So the pattern pieces you'll need is piece number 1, piece number 2, piece number 3. You will also need to cut piece 4 and piece 5 for the front and back facings out of fabric and interfacing. Piece number 6, and I highly recommend that when you're cutting out this lower band piece that you go ahead and cut some of the sides so that you're able to mark this onto the fabric and have a really straight, nice pocket. I'm also going to be using piece number 7. That's going to be our pocket piece. Piece number 8. Piece number 9. Piece 10, that's our sleeve. And piece 11. I'm going to briefly talk about the adjustments that I made for this pattern, because I did do my typical adjustment, but I just want to touch on that here so it can be a little bit more helpful in picking your size. Okay, so as you can see, this piece isn't all of the sizes. It only has 3 sizes within this pattern piece, but it's a good, I'll still be able to demonstrate the same ideas here. So I cut out a size 12, which the finished garment measurements for the bust say that I will get a 39.5-inch bust, or 100.5 centimeter size bust, by cutting out a size 12. My bust is 36 inches. So this will give me 3.5 inches of wearing ease. Now they give you 5.5 inches of ease in this pattern. So technically I should be cutting the size 14. I don't know what the actual measurement is for 14, but it was definitely way bigger than I prefer. I don't like clothes to fit this large on me with 5.5 inches of extra space around me. It's not my favorite way to wear garments. So for me, an oversized fit at 39.5 inches makes sense, but you may actually prefer the 5.5 inches that they give you within the pattern, so you can choose the size band they recommend, or the size that they recommend. So that's kind of how I chose the size that I'm going to be making today, because I don't like my clothing to fit quite that large, but 3.5 inches is good for me. And so another adjustment, or another, I guess, change that I made is by adding 1.5 inches to my bodice pieces. So I added 1.5 inches to piece 1, piece 2, and piece 3. I also added 1 inch to the sleeve measurement so that I can have a slightly longer sleeve, because that again is my preference. So if you are making any adjustments, you want to go ahead and do that at this stage after you've Got the pattern pieces all cut out. And this is just some tissue paper. I will have it linked down below because I honestly use that stuff all the time, especially with Simplicity patterns, all the big 4 patterns. So go ahead and cut out your fabric and mark your notches, and let's get started with construction. And I've pulled out my piece 1 and piece 2, and I'm going to go ahead and connect them along this seam right here. So I've got my piece 2, and I'm going to first start by connecting all the notches. I'm going to be using some clips. These are one of my favorites to use, so I'm going to be using these, especially with knits, because they're so quick and easy to remove. So the first thing I'm going to do is find the notch on piece 2, which is right here, and the notch for piece 1. I'm going to line them up, and I'm going to clip it. Then I also have another notch right down here, and I've got that same notch on my piece 2 as well. So I'm going to line up those notches. So now I've connected these, and as you can see, it's looking a little bit crazy right now, but we're going to start easing in this garment. Actually, first I'm going to go ahead and pin all the way down the rest of piece 1 and 2 down to the bottom. Now I'm going to start easing in this curved part of this pattern, which is going to be what's going to give us the shaping for the chest. So we already lined up one of the notches that they have, but we're going to go from this clip that we have to the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to just be maneuvering these around until I see that the fabric matches up right at the edge. I'm going to start clipping at the edge and add maybe another, probably don't need another clip, but I'm going to just because. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky because this is obviously a rounded curve and this is going the opposite direction. So convex and concave. So what you want to do is start to ease in this pattern, or ease in these 2 pieces. So I'm going to start by just kind of sliding the fabric along itself to make sure that both of these are in a straight line, lining up all together. And as I'm just kind of sliding them along each other, I'm not pulling or anything like that because you don't want to have anything outstretched. These will match up perfectly. You just need to take the time to kind of fiddle along with it until you can get these 2 parts to line up how they're supposed to. I'm going to put a lot of clips because I'm like that. So I've got this entire piece now pinned. So I'm going to take this over to my serger and I'm going to sew this with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and repeat to the other side. Okay, so I have sewn these piece 1 and piece 2 together, and I've pressed all of my seams towards the front, so towards piece 1. I did that for both sides. And so now we're going to move on to step 2, which is to stitch the front to the back at the shoulder seams. So I've got my, oops, that's embarrassing. Okay, so I've got my back piece, and we have got a few notches, one here, and also in the same place on the other side. So we're going to match those up first. I did say we're going to match it first, and then I literally didn't. Well, I did match it, but I didn't clip it there. I'm only going to put 2 pins. And for shoulder seams, you do have the option here of adding some either seam stay tape, which I will probably add in, or you could use 3/8 of an inch elastic in this seam line, or you can just leave it how it is. But you'll want to go ahead and sew these together and press the seam to the back. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Now I'm going to go ahead and work on the neckband. So we're going to grab piece 4 and 5 of the interfacing and the neckband. Okay, so I have got my interfacing for piece 4 and piece 5. And I am going to go ahead and pin this into place real quick before I take it to the ironing board. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the back piece as well. Now I'm going to take these pieces over to my ironing board and press these and adhere them, and then I'll come back and we'll keep talking. Okay, so I have applied my interfacing onto these pieces, and I've also took the liberty of finishing the edge with my serger as well. If you don't have a serger, you don't need to do this step. You can do this with a zigzag stitch if you'd like to. I just like to secure the edge of the interfacing down. It just gives me peace of mind, and I prefer to have no raw edges. So I have applied it. Now what I'm going to do is take the time to go back and re-snip my notches, because after you apply the interfacing, unless you marked the notch, may not line up. But just to be sure, I'm going to go back and recut all of my notches. So now what I'm going to do is attach these both at the short edge. I'm going to find my notches. So now I'm going to go ahead and sew these with my serger again. In the instructions, it says that you can go ahead and finish it after this step, but since I've already finished it, I'm going to obviously not be doing that part, but I will be pressing these towards the back. All right, so I'm going to go back to my finished piece from the top. So piece 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to just lay them out first, and I'm going to trim these real quick. Now I'm going to place my front of the piece going that way and the back going this way, just to make it super easy to pin this neck facing into place. So I am going to take my facing piece and place these right sides together. Let me see. this direction, and it looks real crazy right now. So I'm going to start first with my side seams, which will match up. So I want to make sure that I'm pinning these both with the seam allowances going towards the back. And I'm going to flip. Do the same thing for the other side. Match up those seams. And clip it like that. Then we're going to go in for the notches. So the back piece has 2 notches at the neck edge. So you're going to match up those. Then I'm going to continue pinning around the back neck edge. And then I'm going to go around and do the front as well. Okay, perfect. So I've got this all pinned up, so I'm going to go ahead and sew it with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to come back. Okay, so I know, again, this is looking crazy, but I have sewn on the neck facing, and I have pressed all of the seam allowance around the outside towards the facing. Now I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, not my serger, and I'm going to stitch with a long straight stitch all around to understitch this facing on. Understitching is basically going to attach the seam allowance to the facing so that the garment will roll so that the facing is less visible from the right side. This will keep your facing from just kind of popping up. We are going to top stitch this later, but this is really going to help with how nice it'll look right at the edge around your neck. So this is definitely a step I would say not to skip, especially for a garment like this. So I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam with a long straight stitch. You can, of course, use a zigzag stitch if you wish, but since this is already interfaced, I'm going to go ahead and just use a longer straight stitch here. Okay. So now I have understitched and pressed my facing towards the inside. So you can see that here. Now what I'm going to do is actually flip my garment back to being right sides facing, or I guess so that I can see the inside of the garment. Okay, so now that we have pressed everything, we are ready to go ahead and baste down this neck edge. Now we want to do this 1 inch from the edge. So this part that we just pressed down and understitched, we're going to go 1 inch from there all around. You want to use the loosest, longest stitch that you can manage so that it's easy to pull out this basting thread, because this is just going to be a guide for us to top stitch around later. I am going to be top stitching with my cover stitch, so I'm going to save that for the end because we have a lot more serging to do, but I will leave the basting thread there up until that point. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and come back. Be sure to leave your basting threads nice and long so that it is easy to pull them out later. But now we have that attached. If you have gone ahead and top stitched it, or if you are going to top stitch at this step, you can top stitch using whatever stitch you feel comfortable. For this pattern, you could use a long stitch like your basting stitch. You could also use a zigzag stitch if you like the look of that, but you can also use a twin needle so that you get a nice stretchy stitch. But honestly, using a long straight stitch will work perfectly fine for this design. I am going to be using my cover stitch later on because I do intend to top stitch a couple of other seams as well. But we're going to go ahead and move on now to the next step. Okay, so this is where my instructions and what I'm doing is going to differ quite a bit from the pattern. I'm going to go ahead and put these sleeves in flat to this garment instead of putting them in the round, just because I find that to be just a little bit easier. Well, not a little bit easier, but I just prefer the method of putting in a sleeve flat as opposed to putting it in the round. Okay, so now I've grabbed my sleeve piece and I'm going to start looking for my notches to make sure I'm putting in the correct sleeve to the correct arm side. And I'm going to do this flat. So I'm going to first find the front and the back of my sleeve to match to the front and the back of my bodice. So this is my back and this is my front. I'm going to line these up right sides together. I'm going to go ahead and take the front piece first, and I'm going to match up the sleeves at the corner here and pin it. Then I'm also going to take the back and I'm going to pin it. I'm going to do the same sort of easing that I did with the curve for the front seam in the princess seam kind of situation. So I'm just going to, as before, line these up until they match. Clip. Now I'm coming into my sleeve. I'm going to go ahead and match the seam with the notch. Pin it, making sure the back, the seam allowance is facing towards the back. Then I'm going to match this all around. The same way as before, how I mentioned, sliding the fabric until they line up. You can, of course, do how they say in the pattern. You can, of course, do how they say in the pattern and, you know, do a basting thread to ease these in. But honestly, you can ease them in flat if you're using a fabric that has the right amount of stretch as they indicated in the pattern. So I've got the sleeve all pinned out now. I'm going to do this to the other side and take this to the serger and sew this along at a 5/8 seam allowance. So I have got my sleeves sewn on with my serger. I went ahead and pressed them towards the body. Now what I'm going to do is work on this side seam. So I'm going to sew up all along this arm edge. So I'm going to do this arm all the way down to the bottom of the hem. So from here to here, I'm going to start putting these together first at the seam for the sleeve and the body. Then I'm going to pin together the arm or the sleeve edge at the bottom here. Boop. Then I've got this one at the end where the front and the back meet, and I'm going to pin that in place. Now I'm going to just work on matching up my notches. So I've got one right here. Okay, so I've got this whole side seam now pinned, and I'm going to take this to my serger and sew this up. And do the same thing with this side as well. Okay, so now I have sewn up the side seam, and I have also pressed the side seam so that it's laying nice. This is the back. Oops. And this is the front. All right, perfect. So now we are, I guess, sort of caught up to the sleeve step to where we can add the cuffs onto the bottom of the sleeve. So I have my 2-piece number 11, and I'm going to take these pieces and fold them in half, matching up the long sides together where this top notch is. And I'm going to pin on the side here because this is where we're going to be stitching. I'm going to be taking these 2 pieces, the 2 sleeve cuffs, over to my serger and sewing these down with a 5/8 seam allowance. I'm going to also turn these to the right side and press them. Then I will come back and show you how to attach them onto the sleeve. Okay, so with this sleeve cuff now sewn up, before I pressed it, I made sure to press out the very corners to make sure they're nice and square. I also did double stitch along this cuff to make sure that it doesn't come out. So if you're using a zigzag stitch, you'll want to back stitch at the beginning and end of this cuff. At this stage, you can go ahead and baste along the long edge here. I'm not going to. My fabric's pretty sticky, so it's sticky in the sense that the fabric sticks to itself, so it doesn't move around as much. So I'm not concerned about it coming apart when I do apply this onto the sleeve edge. So I do have a notch right here that I'm going to match up with our sleeve, which has a notch. Where is it? Oh, okay. Which has a notch right here. So I'm going to match that up first. Then I'm going to take the end of this cuff and align it to the seam for the underarm, and I'm going to clip that on as well. Then I'm going to take the other side and do the exact same thing, butting it up to the very end of this other side of the sleeve cuff. So that they meet up right there. Then I'm going to finish pinning or clipping. So before I take this over to my serger and sew around this edge, I'm going to first go to my sewing machine and put a line of basting stitches right over where this seam is so that I'm able to make sure that this will not move anywhere when I put it through my serger. And so I've done that line of basting stitching on this side already, and you can see right at the edge here that when I run this through my sewing machine at my seam line, it's going to stay perfectly aligned and be awesome when I flip it to the right side. So I'm going to go ahead and serge this now.
Okay, so here I'm just showing you how the sleeves are looking. I did go ahead and sew those on with my serger at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I did also press the seams going towards the sleeve. That way when I top stitch, I know I'll be able to catch those in the stitching and it'll just look nice and neat. You can see that split looks really good since I did that basting before I went through and serged everything together. But yeah, that's where we're at right now. I'm really liking how the split lines up with the seam and everything. So one thing you will want to make sure though is that you do press this seam because it will look quite crazy. If you don't, it won't look nearly as nice and professional looking in my opinion. But we're going to move on to the front bands. Well, I guess the band around the top in general. Right now I have piece 9 and I have got that facing right sides up. And I'm also going to grab piece 6, which is going to be our front band piece that has the pocket on it. So you'll know that because either you've marked the pocket or marked the piece, etc. So now I'm going to line this piece up with the side seam, right sides together with that back band piece. I'm going to clip them at the edge and do the exact same thing for the other side, but I'm going to be using clips as I have been using for this process just to make it nice and easy at my serger. So here I am clipping those on and I'm going to work on the opposite side. Now I did make a mistake, but it's not a huge deal. I mixed up my pocket piece with my front band piece, so I want to just caution you by saying to mark your pieces before you start sewing because I just either wasn't paying attention or was just moving real fast, but I ended up grabbing my pocket piece 7 instead of the side piece 8. But yeah, inconsequential. The steps are still the same for you if you're making this pattern, but I do want to just say to be extra cognizant of your pattern pieces because 7 and 8 look really similar. But like I said, inconsequential, totally fine. My top still looks really good, so I'm not complaining, but just letting you know in case you did notice that this piece is wrong because I didn't. I don't know what was going on there. Then I went ahead and attached those band pieces together at the sewing machine or at my serger so then I could sew them together.
So I did attach my band pieces the opposite direction, which was not intentional, but the steps will all be the same. So you'll see my pocket is on the opposite side as to where it is in the pattern, which is inconsequential. If you really want the pocket to be by the seam, you can have it by the seam. I will probably just remark my pocket. It's not a big deal. On the other side by the seam. Listen, it happens. So I'm going to keep moving on because these steps are again still the same. I just apparently have my band on upside down. It's all good. Don't worry about it. It's all good. So I'm going to make a narrow hem at the bottom of my band piece. So the first thing I did was finish off the raw edge of the hem with a serging seam. And so this overcast seam will be a 1/4 inch wide on my machine, but you'll obviously need to make sure that that is still true for your sewing machine if you're doing the same thing. You can also do this with a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch on a sewing machine, but you will have to, of course, figure out what settings you'll need to make it a 1/4 inch. So then I'm going to use that as my guide to press once and then press again, and I have my narrow hem, which will be 5/8 of an inch in total. So I've done that for the rest of my top, and I have pinned it down, and I am going to be doing this on my cover stitch, so I am just going to pin it and leave it for now and then come back to it. But I also went ahead and worked on the narrow hem for the inside part of the slit on the bottom, So the same thing, I didn't actually use my serger to do my narrow hem for this one. I just did it normally, folded in a 1/4 inch, pressed it, folded in another 1/4 inch and pressed it. I'm debating on whether or not I want to do a mitered corner here. It would probably look way better. So maybe I will. So I'll just open up at the corner here. So I'm going to take the corner where my 2 narrow hems are going to meet up, and I'm going to open them out. I'm going to cut off where the 1/4 inch fold is, the first 1/4 inch fold. I'm going to cut at a diagonal there to reduce the bulk in this corner, just straight across. Then I'm going to fold at the 5/8 hem, or the 5/8 fold, which would have been the last fold for both the bottom hem and the side hem. I'm going to refold one and refold again. I don't know how easy this will be to see. Nice. Okay. I really don't know what the instructions would be there, because I'm really just kind of fiddling here to make this as flat and smooth as I can so I can get as straight of a corner as I possibly can. It's a little bit wonky. Nice. Okay. So I've got a couple pins through it. So I just kind of finagled there. You can, of course, spend more time on this if you'd like to. I'm cool with how that looks. I'm going to do it on the other side now. Okay, so I've kind of got the other one in place too. You'll want to go ahead and press this pretty good before you even think about hemming it in the first place. But what I'm going to do now, because I'm not going to hem it at this stage, like I said, I'm going to cover stitch all of my hems at the end of the basic construction that I need to do with my serger. So now what I'm going to do is take this band piece and I'm going to pin it onto the body. Alright, so I've got that all pinned up, and what I'm going to do at this stage is take this over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to put a basting stitch right here at the seam where these two sides come together. That's just going to keep it in place again so that when I go around with my serger, this doesn't spread apart too far. So I'm going to do that first, serge it, press the seam allowance up towards the top, and then I will come back and show you what we're working with. Okay, so now I have attached the bottom band, as you can see here. And I definitely did put the band on backwards, but that's okay. It's still gonna be fine. I just need to remark my pocket. So if you have also done the same thing, this I just flipped around. I don't know how, but I did. So what I'm going to do now is remark the pocket on this side seam. I have already pressed everything, but I just want to go ahead and mark it now so that once I finish doing my cover stitching on all the seams, I will be able to attach the pocket right away. Okay, I'm gonna remove the other pins just so it doesn't confuse me. But yeah, I'm going to now move forward with this design. I have already pressed all of the seams up towards the top. So I'm going to start on this bottom part here, and I'm going to cover stitch along the seam. I'm going to do that for the band on the bottom and for the sleeve bands as well. Going to stitch right here along the band all the way around on both arms. And now I am also going to be top stitching down my neckline with the cover stitch machine, and then we will come back and start working on the front pocket. Okay, oh, but if you are not using a cover stitch machine, at this point you should already have top stitch using your preferred top stitching stitch. I've talked about that in this video as well, so you'll want to go ahead and do that at this step if you haven't been doing that all along, like I'm going to do. And then I'm also going to be top stitching the hem into place as well. I forgot to mention that. I will also be top stitching along the hem. I'm going to start at the split and go around till I get back to the other side of the slit and secure my stitching with a back stitch. Well, it won't be a back stitch, but securing my cover stitch thread. And that will be where I'll be done with all of the hemming, so to speak, and I will move forward with the pocket. Okay, so I have just finished top stitching all of the areas that need to be top stitched in this pattern using a narrow cover stitch. You're not going to be able to really see it except for spots right here because obviously this is black and I use black thread, but I did go ahead and add in my tag. So I've done the front and the back of the neckline obviously, and I did the sleeve cuff right along the edge here. Actually, I could probably zoom in. Boop. Okay, so I've also cover stitched the sleeve hems. Where's the other one? This one has more black, so you're not going to be able to see it as well. But then I also top stitched the band to the top, as I mentioned, and of course the hem of the top. Also top stitch that as well. So now we're going to move on to the pocket. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do with the pocket is to mark the fold line. Now, it doesn't really tell you in the instructions to mark this, but if you do see a fold line, just always notch at that line. So I've got 2 notches on my pocket here. So I'm going to fold down and pin, or clip, shall I say, that into place. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew a basting stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all around the raw edge of the pocket. That's going to secure this top fold down, and it's also going to give us a great guide on where we're going to fold later on in the pattern. I'm also going to add a line of basting stitching all at the corner of the pocket, and it's going to be a 1/4 inch from the edge so that I'm able to ease that in. So I'm going to go ahead and do those basting stitches right now, and then I'm going to come back and show you what that looks like and how we will start to manipulate this pocket piece. Okay, so now we're looking at the back of the pocket now that I have put those basting stitches in. So one that goes all the way around and one that's just at the corner of the, or at the 2 corners of the rounded bottom of the pocket. So I did just want to mention that I'm using my cover stitch again, I know probably for like the 30th time in this video, so I'm not going to be finishing this raw edge here because it's just a little bit unnecessary because the cover stitching will finish the other side of this pocket. So if you are not going to be using a cover stitch, you can finish the raw edge with your overlocker or a zigzag stitch, and that will properly finish off the edge of this pocket because it should be, or you can fold it under how they describe in the pattern, doing a 1/4 inch fold here so that it will be completely enclosed when you top stitch. Could also be a really great way to finish the pocket as well, but as I mentioned, I'm going to be using my cover stitch. So at this stage we have come to the point to where we can go ahead and fold this to the right side. This fold line here, I'm going to push it all the way out on the edge. This is where acrylics really come in handy. Okay. And I'm going to go all the way around, following that basting stitch that goes all the way around here, and I'm going to press at the ironing board. And I'm going to use this basting thread that we have that's a 1/4 inch away from the edge to help us perfect this curve at the ironing board. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now and show you what it looks like afterwards. Okay. So we're also going to be working to make this curve look nice and curvy by pulling on the bottom thread of the basting stitch that we put that was a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and by drawing those in, you'll see it starts to curl in already on its own. So you don't need to pull too tightly, and I'm actually going to kind of ease it out a little bit too. But while you're at your ironing board, you can adjust how much you've pulled those threads, or how much you pull those threads to get the shape that you need for this pocket. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then I will come back and we will put this pocket onto the top. Alright, so I have finished this pocket, or not finished it, but I have pressed it to be a rounded shape. As you can see, it's nice and folded in on the inside. You will want to go ahead and take out the threads that are the basting threads that are for the 1/4 inch mark. You can go ahead and take out the other basting threads as well, but I would wait on the longer basting thread, because at this point you're going to want to top stitch your pocket down right at the fold, or like not right at the fold, but right at the edge here. So you want to go ahead and go across there with whatever top stitching method you prefer. And then we are going to go ahead and grab our shirt and place this onto the top so that we can sew it on. So we are looking at the front of our top, and we're going to be working on the right front piece. This is actually, my fronts are actually flipped around from the pattern, as I've already mentioned. So it's a little bit different than the way that yours looks if you'd actually follow the right side, but it doesn't really matter. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this front piece, so your piece number 6, whichever side it's on. Alrighty, so I have gotten my pocket marked,
and I've top stitched my pocket at the top 1 inch from the folded edge that we pressed earlier. I'm just going to line up my pocket right at the top of this seam, or I guess right below this seam. And now I'm going to go ahead and pin my pocket into place and top stitch it down. At this point, I have also removed all of the basting stitches because I've pressed this pocket into place. So if you are at the same step, go ahead and pull out your basting stitches before you sew it down, because it'll be so much easier than trying to pull it out later. Alright, this pocket looks quite tortured with all of the pins in, but I'm going to go ahead and take this back to my cover stitch machine, and I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch, maybe even 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the pocket all the way around, and then that's going to be me done with this top. Okay.